Hello and welcome. My name is Meepless, they, he, she, and today we are looking at and talking about ducks. 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton, published by Drawn and Quarterly at the end of 2022 and winner of the 2023 Canada Reads competition. A book that, somewhat ironically, came in right as I was writing up my comic strips for Lit Nerds video, which highlighted her previous webcomic Hark A Vagrant because I was so impatient with not getting my hands on this memoir fast enough. Content notes for long-term degradation of one's humanity for being a woman, RAPE, and an unsafe work environment on a couple of levels. Spoiler alert, but I will rate this book pretty highly and would generally recommend it as a really interesting book. That said, I would also say that it's a good idea to really assess how this material might impact your mental health and not take that lightly either. Although that is not to say that I think Beaton treads lightly or in any way mishandles the material of her life. I mean, it'd be kind of rude for me to accuse anyone of doing that when it comes to memoirs. But I do think that Beaton sets the bar high in exploring the hard-to-tackle themes of this part of her life. How one depicts RAPE can be a very personal choice, and one that everyone else is almost guaranteed to have an opinion on. The way that my opinion has been formed reading comics and watching movies, I don't see much point, other than sensationalism, for acts of sexual violence to play out in detail on the page. Beaton seems to agree with that as well, and the majority of the focus goes to how Beaton was impacted emotionally and how meaningless it seems to have been to everyone else in both situations. But hitting some of my standard review points before we get into further analysis, flipping to the back of the book, Kate Beaton describes herself as, quote, born and raised in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. After graduating from Mount Allison University with a double degree in history and anthropology, she moved to Alberta in search of work that would allow her to pay down her student loans. During the years she spent out west, Beaton began creating webcomics under the name Hark A Vagrant, quickly drawing a substantial following around the world. End quote. Keywords that came to mind reading this memoir: community, gender, displacement, capitalism, and humanity. The summary on Goodreads is, quote, before there was Kate Beaton, New York Times bestselling cartoonist of Hark A Vagrant fame, there was Kate Beaton of the Cape Breton Beatons, specifically Mabou, a tight-knit seaside community where the lobsters are as abundant as beaches, fiddles, and Gaelic folk songs. After university, Beaton heads out west to take advantage of Alberta's oil rush, part of the long tradition of East Coasters who seek gainful employment elsewhere when they can't find it in the homeland they love so much, with the singular goal of paying off her student loans. What the journey will actually cost Beaton will be far more than she anticipates. Arriving at Fort McMurray, Beaton finds work in the lucrative camps owned and operated by the world's largest oil companies. Being one of the few women among thousands of men, the culture shock is palpable. Being one of the few women among thousands of men, the culture shock is palpable. It does not hit home until she moves to a Spartan, isolated worksite for higher pay. She encounters the harsh reality of life in the oil sands, where trauma is an everyday occurrence, yet never discussed. Her wounds may never heal. Beaton's natural cartooning prowess is on full display as she draws colossal machinery and mammoth vehicles set against the sublime Albertan backdrop of wildlife, northern lights, and Rocky Mountains. Her first full-length graphic narrative, Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands, is an untold story of Canada, a country that prides itself on its egalitarian ethos and natural beauty while simultaneously exploiting both the riches of its land and the humanity of its people. End quote. Moving back into the realm of opinion, as I often do with books I really like, I clicked through to the 1- and 2-star reviews over on Goodreads, which was certainly thought-provoking in some ways. Looking at the craft of ducks, I felt like some of the negative reviews went a bit hard, although this is not unusual for a book that breaks out of the graphic novel bubble and starts getting recommended generally by, quote, important people and prizes. I mean, it's certainly valid for someone to say they don't like the art style, but frankly, it's pretty standard, and saying it's bad or saying it doesn't hold up to Fun Home or Persepolis seems a bit ridiculous. And since you are mostly tuning into this video for my opinion, I felt like I found page layouts and story progression very easy to follow. Character designs were fairly distinct and expressive. The color scheme really augments the vibes of the book. It is perhaps a bit long, But like some of the more valid critiques of this book, I feel like that circles back to a choice that Beaton clearly made to tightly constrain herself within the boundaries of her experience at the oil sands. Her aim was to cover the 2 years she lived in the oil sands, and I feel like the length is in some ways part of building the experience for readers. I'm also not sure what I would have suggested be cut if for some reason it was up to me. The other main critique I saw people make of the book that I took more seriously was the fact that this is a very white settler focused book. I do think this is a fair critique, although fitting this review into the river of my reviews of nonfiction comics, I do feel like memoirs often, not always, have some limitations on diversity by their nature that are less excusable in fiction. Similarly to the choices about length that I just talked about, Beaton also seems to have chosen to focus on representing her own naivete over inserting analysis and information that she has hopefully gained since this experience, which does seem to be hinted at by the contents of her afterword. Reading said afterward, I had not realized that Beaton's time in the oil sands was quite so long ago, namely 2005 to 2008. It does seem to add more plausibility to just how incredibly naive she was, but then again, I was much younger at that point and blissfully ignorant of the oil sands entirely, so perhaps I am giving her too much benefit of the doubt. Of course, this ignorance was still born out of a shared social location as white settlers indoctrinated by white supremacist cultures. Thinking a bit about race and culture, while Beaton does include her interactions with a few non-white workers in the oil sands, I would say the main focus of her examination of life and work in the oil sands is of white people from the Maritimes coming to the oil sands to work, which is something I did find interesting, especially the ways that she chose to maintain and represent the accents at play. But this is obviously limited, and as someone who appreciates people talking about their own experiences, my initial impression was actually an appreciation that Beaton stays in her lane. And as usual, that she didn't pretend to be some unbiased arbiter of total truth and let her personality show. Circling back a bit to talk about the gender and sexuality aspects of her memoir, I saw criticism of this book saying Beaton was distinctly unfun and making a mountain out of a molehill on the one side, and that she was a letdown to the Me Too movement for not going hard enough against the men who harassed and assaulted her on the other. I would say both takes are a bit ridiculous. Beaton's assertion that it is the environment of the oil sands that brings out the worst in her coworkers is pretty valid in my opinion. It was also interesting to see Beaton be so vulnerable about how she dealt with the feelings of guilt after friends and family who joined her in the oil sands suffered similar dehumanization. Class analysis was also a pretty strong undercurrent in the whole memoir, which is always a highlight for me as it is something so often glossed over or ignored. Disability saw some interesting exploration in that, much like many colonizer projects, the oil sands is also a pretty disabling environment, although this was largely limited to the physical injury of workers on site with a nod to the ongoing health issues that come from the environmental impacts of the oil sands. Getting to a point of conclusion, I'm left with at least a handful of questions that are going to go unanswered for now because life is kicking my butt. So even doing this much is extremely difficult and time-consuming. I really hope that we see more diverse comics about the oil sands, and I hope that the wide popularity of this graphic novel convinces at least a few more Americans that Canada is not as great as it is often represented as being. What do you think? I'm going to rate this book 4 stars. Bye y'all, keep reading, and organized to end capitalist oppression. And as always, Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, non-Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.